a new Conservative government will launch a judicial inquiry into Justin Trudeau's corruption scandal. The only way to get to the bottom of this scandal and get the answers Canadians deserve is to hold a judicial inquiry. And the only way to do that is to defeat Justin Trudeau on October 21st. Second, we will pass the No More Cover-Ups Act to prevent corrupt politicians like Justin Trudeau from hiding behind cabinet confidentiality to escape police investigation.
A different kind of election promise. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says he would call for a judicial inquiry into the SNC-Lavalin affair. That was the controversy that rocked the Liberal government this spring and led to the resignation of two cabinet ministers, Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, and their eventual removal from the Liberal caucus. Scheer is also promising to bring in what he calls the No More Cover-Ups Act, with the aim of giving the RCMP more access to cabinet confidences. The Tory leader made this announcement right in Justin Trudeau's Papineau riding. So will it resonate with voters? Time for the Power Panel. Everyone is in Toronto tonight, leaving me all by myself. Tim Murphy, Managing Director of Macmillan Vantage. Alongside him, Melissa Lanceman of Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and a few feet away, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, now Chief of Government Relations for the University of Toronto, and freelance journalist and host of the Safe Space podcast, Vicky Machama, is next to Andrew. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Andrew, why don't I start with you? That central question that we asked there, will it resonate with voters? What do you think?
Well, I'm going to go with it'll reinforce the views of people who already have views on this SNC matter, and I don't think it's going to really change things one way or the other. I have to say I'm not a huge fan of politicians calling for judicial inquiries on their adversaries and opponents. I don't know that we're at that stage where that's warranted at this point. I know the NDP has done something similar. In terms of what Andrew Scheer is calling for, though, in terms of providing the RCMP with greater access to cabinet confidences, I do think that there is some merit in that, and putting that up front is a commitment on the part of the Conservatives is probably not an entirely bad idea at this point, because people are wondering what else do you do with this news that isn't entirely polarized and partisan.
Right. Vicky, what do you think if the idea is that this speaks to people who have already formed an opinion? Does it speak to them enough that it could be a motivating factor or something that reminds them they need to get up and vote Conservative, for example?
I think this is, part and parcel with the Conservative response last week to the blackface scandal. I think it motivates already committed Conservative voters to make sure that they get out and vote and that they speak to Conservative leaning people about voting for the Conservatives. I don't necessarily know that it moves the dial, especially on this investigation. The RCMP says they won't pursue it any further during the election period, so it's not necessarily going to do anything more than that. But I think it's fascinating to see the strategy of him announcing this in Justin Trudeau's riding. I think there's possibly a very intentional plan here to depress turnout for the Liberals and for the NDP in those ridings.
What do you think about that, Melissa? Talk a bit about the location, because there's being in Papineau, but there's also being in Quebec, where the controversy was viewed differently, many pundits have argued, versus in the rest of Canada.
I think that generally you'll see campaigns running two different campaigns, one that is in Quebec and one that is in the rest of Canada. In this case, I think he brings the conversation in the rest of Canada to Quebec. But location aside, I think what this does for the Tories, or what it's supposed to do for the Tories, is it's supposed to bring the conversation back to a referendum on the Prime Minister, on his judgment, and on a number of things that we might not know about, whether it's how many times he dressed up in blackface, whether it's what he does, what he says on feminism and what he actually does. And it brings back those issues rather than going after the same issue of blackface over and over and over again. So this is just a different way of bringing doubts into the minds of voters about the Prime Minister, what he says he does and what he actually does.
So Tim, if that's the goal, who does it resonate with? Andrew was saying how it's talking to people, or Vicky, who are already voting Conservative or who might be leaning that way. Does it also, do you think, speak to what we've seen really in the last few days through the polls, the segment of voters that seem to have been impacted to some degree, and not a huge degree, but to some degree by the emergence of those photos last week, are younger voters? I think that's exactly what specifically the Angus Reid poll showed. It wasn't huge. I'm not trying to say that everything changed overnight, but do you think this message resonates with them or not at all?
I think it's dumb on two grounds. One is politically and the other is substantively. Other than that, I really don't have an opinion. But on the political grounds, I really don't understand a strategy that has 0 votes in it being launched in Quebec, where actually it's viewed entirely different, as you noted off the top, where I think the notion that your Prime Minister fighting for a an important Quebec company, important Quebec jobs, was actually more dominant the narrative in Quebec, and for him to go in there and highlight that, I think, is just very bizarre politically, especially in respect of an issue that isn't really going to mobilize any votes anywhere. And then substantively, I think his promises are dumb on two counts. One of it, the politicizing a judicial inquiry, like, it's just a weird concept. I'm going to call an inquiry into a guy if I win. Well, who actually cares? And now you've politicized a process that shouldn't be politicized. But let's dig into this. He's got this other idea related to Section 39 of the Canada Evidence Act. But actually, the whole procedure for properly dealing with cabinet confidences in the Canada Evidence Act was done by way of a direction from an Attorney General to every crown across this country. And do you know who authored that? How outrageous political machination there were? It was Peter MacKay. And that's how this whole procedure, so in other words, it was Scheer's former Harper government that laid out the proper process for dealing with it, of which he was a part, and it was the Attorney General who laid it out. So I think when you dig down deep, it's dumb substantively and dumb politically.
My question then, Andrew, is Tim has done his digging. How many Canadians do you think are going to dig to that level and instead hear the idea that the Conservative government feels there's more to be investigated? Or Conservative government would, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the risk here is that it starts sounding just shrill and partisan in terms of judicial inquiry. If he had gone simply with the idea of allowing more RCMP access to the cabinet confidences, I suspect that would have been stronger ground. But this is an odd strategy to be going on now. I think part of it is that he's looking at a way to insert himself back into the story around Trudeau's lax judgment and his temperament that he wasn't able to get last week because he simply didn't have credibility on it. And I think that that's really kind of what's at play here, is he's trying to work that angle on an issue that works to the Conservatives' advantage. Certainly on SNC, that's an issue that plays to the Conservative advantage. Do
you think that's true, Vicky?
I mean, I think, Vassy, you pointed out last week, millennials responded to the blackface scandal. What I find is that they don't respond to this one at all. This is seemingly opaque to them, and if there's any response, there's a sense that, well, that's just how politics functions. And so I think it only lends to that cynicism that millennials might have about voting. And being the largest voting bloc, this doesn't really resonate with them. And so again, it's one of those things that who it responds to are people who already cared about this, who cared about it when the Globe and Mail published their first story. They haven't picked up on it since.
Do you think would you agree with that, Melissa, that it speaks to people who already agree something nefarious happened?
I think there is some merit in actually saying that this moves no votes, but I don't think any of the leaders announced anything today that would necessarily move votes. But what it does do is it squarely puts the conversation back on Trudeau, back on his conduct, and back on the things that we don't know about. And to answer your question about who's looking into this as deep as Tim, well, it's actually just Tim and the people now trying to prove Tim wrong.
I'm sorry, I'm actually trying to use facts. I know it's weird in this election, but I'm trying.
You're allowed to. Last word to you, Tim.
Well, I think I agree with Vicky. I think actually this is just noise to millennial voters. I think it doesn't really move votes. I think at the end of the day that what will be actually the thing people remember from today is the pictures from the campaign today. And I think those gorgeous visuals of the Prime Minister canoeing in the Northern Ontario Lake will be what dominates people's memory out of today.
Your canoe tax credit.
Hi, I'm Vassy Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.